Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And very good morning to esteemed guests, honorable speakers, lecturers of IIiBF staff, organizing committees, and all participants. Today we have the privilege of exploring the topic of talent development in Islamic finance, some reflection on its past, present, and future, with our esteemed guest, Speaker Mr. Daud Vicary, Managing Director of DBA Consulting in Barhat. As we gather here today, I would like to remind everyone of the words of the legendary businessman and CEO, Steve Jobs, who once said, innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. We hope that through today's talk, we will be able to discover new ways to foster innovation and development in the field of Islamic finance. I am Indi Alangir Hussain. I am honored to be your MC for today's IIiBF CEO Talk Series number 1. The topic is talent development in Islamic finance, some reflection on its past, present, and future. As we already commenced the program, I would like to remind everyone to switch off their mobile phone or put them on silent mode to avoid any disruption. To gain the blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let us commence this session by reciting Kitab Surah Al-Fatih. Now it's time to play the national anthem. Nagaraku, humbly request to all, please stand and show respect while the national anthem is playing. I would like to request the technical team to play the national anthem. Thank you very much, Brother Daud, for playing the national anthem. Now it's time to play the IIM song.
Let's lead the way, lighten the future, share the wisdom to the spirit of Islam. Revelation and reason, we shall excel, we shall prevail. Merging faith and knowledge, we the Khalifa, we will fulfill the Amana. Together, we make the world a better place. Forever, expand the culture of Iqra. IIiBF is to realize the meaning of expand the culture of Ikra. IIUF is to realize the meaning of mercy to all worlds for
Thank you very much, Brother Daud, for playing this Lion song and national anthem. As you already know, our Honorable Dean of IIiBF, Prof. Hussein, is not here due to some prior commitment. But we have our Honorable Deputy Dean of IIiBF, Assistant Professor Dr. Habibullah Zakaria. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Habibullah Zakaria for delivering his welcoming.
Mr. Jefferson. Bismillah, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Our speaker today is Mr. Daud Vicary, demonstrator that busy on parts and parts, students, learners, industry players. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving us the opportunity that we gather here together. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this occasion the best one. On behalf of Professor Dr. Hassan, I would like to welcome English speaker, Mr. Daud Vicary, for accepting, and we would like to thank him for accepting our invitation for this very significant and important topic, which is on talent development and finance. Of course, as you know, Daud is very in industry for quite a long time, decades, in research and other institute of institution in the family banking. We believe that with this kind of vision, we can be enlightening and get more update and information on current development in Islamic finance and some reflection of the past, present, and future. And as you know that this institute, IIUM, Institute of Private and Finance, was established for this purpose, to support the industry with the finance, whether in Sharia, regulatory, whether in terms of supervision, in terms of other segments of Islamic finance. Not only banking, but other like work-up, zakat, and so on. I would believe that this kind of series, the old talk series, is very important for not only lecturers, but even student educators, industry players, to be enlightened and see whether there are certain things that we can take into consideration in order to fill the gap in Islamic finance. I don't want to take much time. I think this is very eager. I also believe that many of us eager to listen from our distinguished esteemed guest, Mr. Daud Vicary. But as the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man la yashkuru nas la yashkuru." Who does not thank his conspiration to people who do not thank Allah. I would like to thank all the organizing committee, Dr. Hazizi, thank you so much, and all the committee in this team, Brother Langui, and other team members of our academic society. With that, we'd like to teach you the Hidayah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Habibullah Zakaria, for your amazing, comprehensive, but very short welcome remarks. Thank you very much. So I know why you all are waiting for. So now I will move into our main agenda. We'll begin our much awaited talk session by our guest speaker, Mr. Daud Vicary, with his wealth of experience and expertise in the field of Islamic finance. We are certain that his insights on talent development will be enlightening and invaluable. Now, it's my utmost pleasure to invite the coordinator of today's event, Honorable Distinguished Assistant Professor, Dr. Nurdul Hazizi, to continue the session. Dr. Nurdul Hazizi, please, from now and onwards, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Brother Akid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Thank you so much, Edward, for being here. The numbers here, new cases, and also the 10-year cases as well. First of all, I'd like to thank Daud Vicary for accepting the invitations. Maybe I can share with you what happened before we finally managed to get him here. So we had several discussion before. I thought it's just going to be a short meeting, getting to know what's the topic and so on. But it turns out to be, I think, 1 hour discussion. So it's just another pre-talk before this talk. So I think he's a very passionate talker. I think most of you will be benefiting from his sharing of ideas. And he's a very experienced person, both in industry and also in academia. So, but before that, let me just read his short profile. Mr. Daud Vicary Abdullah is the managing director of IIiBF Consulting. I think it was established in 2008, you mentioned, right? It's a long time ago. And also, he's a trustee at the Responsible Finance and Investment Foundation, RFI. He's also the former president and CEO of INSEF University, former global leader for Islamic finance at Deloitte, former CEO of 2 startup Islamic banks in Malaysia. And during his retirement, it's very interesting that he put retirement in as in retirement. So I'm not sure what he means by that, but he focuses on using his experience to support SRI and SPT to support things that we're going to discuss today. And young experience, you should have seen many young faces today. And then he shares several boards. In fact, to get him today is a really remarkable things to get him here. He also a chartered professional in Islamic finance and also a fellow in CPA Australia. So let me just explain a bit on the format because Mr. Daud actually requesting the format to be more like a dialogue sessions. So we have divided the session into 3 sections, 3 subtopics. So during the topics, there will be some interaction from the audience, and also I'm also monitoring from the Zoom link here. So anyone have a question, you can post in the chat box. But without further delay, I think we're going to listen to Mr. Daud session first, and then after that we will be open for Q&A. So without further ado, sir, floor is yours.
Thank you. My thanks to Professor Hazizi, to the Deputy Dean, to the Dean, all the faculty committee, and to the university. This is an experience. I enjoyed it that day, but as you said, fitting into my calendar is sometimes a challenge. And I wanted to say what a privilege it is to be. I wouldn't be here speaking to you today for probably 2 reasons, but it's the same person. I have a mentor in Islamic finance. His name is Mustafa Ahmad. And I would not have been here. He would not have answered my cry for help nearly 30 years ago as a non-Muslim then, but as a reasonably experienced operational banker to help me understand what Islamic finance was. And he's been able to help me, and we still meet. In fact, today is our day for meeting. Thursday breakfast with our Muslim is a regular event where we put the worlds to right and talk to the family. But right now he's working on his PhD, so I'm helping him with that. I'm mentioned there were two reasons why I would not be. So I wouldn't have converted to Islam, and I wouldn't have learned anything about Islamic finance if he hadn't started me on the journey. And I'll refer to that experience and the experience which has been ongoing for a number of years as I talk. But before I start talking, I just wanted to get you guys, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm looking around the room. I try to scan and observe all the faces, but just a show of hands each time with this. I'm really just trying to figure out where people come from in the sense of, are you a student, are you an academic, or are you in industry? Let's do that. So if you're a student, can you raise your hand? Okay, you students, I won't ask what you're studying just yet. It may come out when you start asking me questions. Academics. Here we have it here. So I have to. So students used to be washing out. The better questions should be coming from the academics. Okay. And from the industry. So a few from industry. I recognise one or two faces there. Mostly good to see you again. And I'm not sure who's online, and it would be difficult physically, I think, to get people to wave up their hands. But I'm assuming you fall into those three categories, and I'm waving at the screen. So welcome to all of you as well. There's a question there. Okay, I was going to get to that, but you're way ahead of me. So you probably had one more strong copy than I have. So what's the other category? Anybody else who's not covered? And do you have a microphone there or no?
Maybe you can come sit in front. Yeah, so everyone,
I can just hear you, but I think the people online won't be able to hear you.
so there will be a speaker. Sorry, the microphone front. Yeah. So please.
So you have a different category. You're a graduate. So does that mean no? Okay, so there's a separate topic. Are you employed or unemployed or look? You're looking for a job. Interesting. So that might be very relevant. Okay. Well, welcome all of you. It's impossible to please everybody all of the time, so I make my apologies to start with. Say that I hope what I have to say, what I have to share with you will be of use and will be interesting. As Professor Hesidi mentioned, we're running into three segments and simply put their past, present, and future. So I wanted to sort of dwell a little bit on the past, because if you don't understand where you come from, it's very difficult to understand where you're going. I don't know if anybody of you have been through any form of consulting training. It doesn't matter if you haven't. This is very simple, but there's a very, very straightforward saying in consulting. It's that you must always start with establishing the as-is position. And the as-is position is what you have right now. Okay. And the next thing you need to do, having established the as-is position, is the to-be position. What are you trying to get to? And if you imagine a map, that you have to have a starting place. If you don't know where you're starting from, how on earth do you get to where you're supposed to be going? Okay. And this is particularly relevant, I think, also in talent development. That understanding where you are, and that usually historically is where you've been. And I'm going to get a little bit of up and put something on the whiteboard. Your default speaker has changed to speaking. No, I'm just going to write something on the board, which I'll put over here. Hopefully, people can see it. F-B-A-R. What does that spell? First test. Do we ask the academics first? Yes, let's start. Okay. This is something, the STAR framework is something I adapted nearly 20 years ago. When I came back to Malaysia after a spell in Korea for 2 years. and I set up Deloitte's Global Centre of Excellence for Islamic finance here in Malaysia. And it was the first professional accounting firm, a consulting firm, that set up a Global Centre of Excellence in Malaysia. Ernst & Young had already set one up, but that was in Bahrain for reasons which nothing Ernst & Young, you better ask them why, but it was in Malaysia. And we did a lot of work at that time in helping countries, institutions, regulatory authorities all around the world, so this is in the naughty, understand what they had to do to set up Islamic banking and finance, as we called it at that time. And the STARS framework was something which we used as a basis to establish the ADIs, and it applied to every country. And if you imagine, countries are different. Malaysia is different from Indonesia. Not so much in language or culture, but in terms of infrastructure. And the STARS framework may help you understand that. Let me just spell out what STARS stands for, then you'll remember it. First S is for Sharia. And I'll put legal. Legal framework. Second is tax. Third is accounting. R is regulatory. The final S is standard. I'm back to the microphone so everyone can hear that. So STARS is an acronym to help you remember it, but the trouble is I hardly ever remember my own acronym. I lived in Malaysia for 10 years before I knew what DJ. Being English, it meant the German. Okay, Sharia legal framework, tax framework, the accounting framework, the regulatory framework, and the standard framework, in my experience, is different in every country you go to. In an age of globalization, it's got better, but there are no real global standards yet for any of these. And if you look at, what exists in a country, you're looking at the Sharia and legal framework. I'll give an example. What's the basis in Malaysia for the Sharia and legal framework? And I'm thinking here particularly of the legal framework. Anybody want to hazard a guess? It's an easy question.
Maybe you want to.
From a legal standpoint, what's the basis? The framework. English common law, correct. Absolutely spot on. Indonesia, what's the basis? Dutch civil code. That answers quite nicely the question of why has Indonesia taken so long to develop an Islamic finance? The answer is exactly that. A civil code is wrapped into the constitution. Common law gives you an immense amount of flexibility. So Malaysia has an advantage there. The tax framework. Tax frameworks are different in every country, and Malaysia had to make some changes in order to facilitate Islamic finance, but because it was based on English common law, it was a bit easier than other locations. But understanding the tax framework is important. The accounting framework, we're closer now to accounting standards which are accepted, global accounting standards. On Islamic accounting standards, there's more acceptability, and I don't want to go into a debate as to why IIiBF standard not being adopted in Malaysia, and Malaysia has its own standard. I was on the board of IIiBF for 4 years, which was an interesting experience. I was the token white guy. The board in Bahrain in the early 40s. But those tax, the way tax is handled in different countries is in the framework As you're all aware, Malaysia's regulatory framework insofar as Islamic finance and the Islamic economy is the most advanced. Doesn't mean we'll remain the most advanced, but we have been the most advanced. I think others are chipping away at it, but it's an important framework to understand. And standards cover just about everything else. Education standards, attitude, documentation standards, you name it, any standards are there. If you don't understand those in your location, you're not going to be able to do much to advance and move to a new to be. Okay, so I may refer back to STARS on a regular basis, but in terms of looking at our place where we are or where we've been, that will be. That's the first slide up here. And I mentioned I'm going to do 3 areas of slides. And the first one is the path. Well, we had to start somewhere. That's what I call it. And we did. And we started predominantly learning hand to mouth. My experience in this industry goes back 30 years. My experience in the banking, finance, and consulting industry goes well over 50 years now. I wouldn't say it's 50 years of experience, but I probably repeated a few during that time. But there's been a reasonable amount of experience which has come in. And it's interesting that we try to understand where we've been. We lose sight of why we are where we're at today. What I will say over the next several minutes or during the course of this morning is very much a personal insight. I was there for some of the time, if not quite a lot of it. It's not something that I'm sort of looking back on with the help of a textbook or articles or whatever the equivalent of the social media was 30 years ago. I can tell you, I don't think there was much. It was newspaper articles, magazine articles, wasn't much else. But I was there and I lived it, and you felt it, and you interacted with people on how you wanted to do this thing. My own personal experience in Islamic finance came in the early 90s, and it was here in Malaysia. And I was working as an independent consultant. I ran my own business. I was working at a bank called UMBC. Anybody here remember UMBC? United Malayan Banking Corporation. Hold up your hand if you remember UMBC. This is the early 90s. Oh, I was born late. Okay. Don't know how old I am. Well, UMBC still exists today. It's just called by another name, called RHB. And it had a transition from UMBC to being the Stein Bank. The Stein Derby bought it out. Then Rashid Hussain bought it out. But at UMBC, which I was working at in the early 90s, was the 3rd largest banking group in Malaysia at that time. And I was working on a project which was modernizing processes and systems within the bank. Basically, it was moving from distributed accounting and distributed loan processing, in other words, at the branch, to centralized accounting and centralized loan processing. Does anybody not understand what I mean by that? Distributed processing and centralized processing. And distributed processing, as it stood then, wasn't much. There wasn't much automation, but it gave the branches enormous power and control over what got accounted for and how lending or financing was done. And the bank wanted to be operationally more efficient. It wanted to have centralized control over accounting, so accounting standards were applied throughout the bank. And it also wanted to have centralized credit control over all of its loan processing, because they were concerned that individual branch managers of the 80 or so branches around the country may not be doing things in a way that was consistent with the policy of the bank. So there was huge resistance to change from the branches because the power was there, not at head office. The power was going to move to head office. So there was a lot of what I would call office politics in order to do this. And in the midst of this exercise, and I was working as the consultant on what was called operational processes, process re-engineering. You know, if you're distributing everything and your loan processing takes place in the branch, and all of a sudden it's going to take place in head office, it means you need different people in different places and different processes to support it. Similarly with centralized accounting. In the midst of this, then we had a steering committee of very senior people for UNBC, including the board meeting, the board members. And I was called to a board meeting, or a project board meeting one day, for an update report. I wasn't in charge of the project, but I was in charge of banking processes. And I thought they wanted an update on the state of play of the project. It was going okay-ish. Had a few problems, but it was okay-ish. And they asked me this question. We just received a letter from Bank Negara Malaysia saying that all banks in Malaysia will open an Islamic banking window by the end of 1993, and that a second Islamic banking license was going to be granted to what is now called Bank Muamalah. From 83 to 93, as I'm sure all of you know, Bank Islam was set up and it had a 10-year moratorium. No other Islamic bank was to be set up in Malaysia. It had a monopoly of Islamic banking. Bank Negara, and I'm assuming the government, had a vision that they wanted to do more in Islamic banking. And they wrote to the banks and they said, please open an Islamic window. No further instruction. Open an Islamic window. Forget what the question was that I got from the board of UNBC. Please tell us what we have to do to open an Islamic window. I responded because I have a sense of humor. I realized that they didn't understand my sense of humor. The old UNBC building was a tower on Jalan Sultan Soleil. And from that tower, you could quite easily see the old railway station of Central KL, which was built to architectural design of a Moorish design. And that's about all I knew about Islamic banking or Islamic anything, but I just pointed at the station and said, you mean windows like that? I'd never heard of it. I've been in banking 20 years at that time, 20 or more years. And they looked at me and said, you're the banking expert, you better find out where to go, what to do. And that's where I started. And I started looking, and there was absolutely no time. Zero. No book, nothing written, no research papers. You went to the Islamic bookshop, and basically they were giving you books and guidelines, mainly published in Saudi, about how to convert to Islam. I did later, and I didn't read Saudi. I had a different source by that. There was absolutely nothing on Islamic economics. There were a few books, but they were just, shall we say, Sharia-based, which I didn't even understand at that time. And it seemed to use lots of Arabic writing, which I couldn't read, and lots of Arabic terminology, which was just gobbledygook. When I started learning about Islamic banking later in my life, not much later, but later, I had huge problems with pronouncing Arabic words. I used to have what was called my problem. Musharaka, Mudaraba, Murabaha, what? How do you say that? How do you say that? You say it now, and I know what they mean, but at the time, I didn't know the difference between one from the other. I didn't understand the fundamental concepts. It was a completely different thing. Where to go to find out? And well, my starting point was finding people who knew something. So the target zone was Bank Islam. Because nobody in UNBC or indeed any other bank in Malaysia had the foggiest notion. And there didn't seem to be any sort of rule of thumb that said, well, if you're Muslim, you must understand what Islamic banking or Islamic finance is. I asked all my Muslim friends who were working on the project, and they gave blank looks as I gave. Yeah, as blank looks. 30 years ago. Nobody understood it. Nobody knew it existed. Nobody knew what it was. I didn't even know the term riba then, but I bet if I'd asked any Muslim to explain what riba was 30 years ago, there's a pretty good chance they wouldn't have been able to explain what it was. I'm not going to ask you now, because it's a bad place to start to explain what Islamic finance is about, in my opinion. So what did I do? You have to start somewhere. I asked people who knew something, and relationships were built up, and slowly, over a period of time, 3 months or so, spending time with people who knew about the topic, it was passed on to me by word. Okay. I don't know if you want to interject here, moderator, with anything.
You mentioned about was the other thing but the question about the high dependency on consulting companies comes again after COVID. So how do you see the talent pool right now moving towards consulting firms? And again, so like this financial institution are very much more reliant on consulting than before.
Cool. It's a good question to answer. Sorry, I'll answer that as simply as I can, looking at the past. At the past, in the 90s, nobody knew anything, apart from a few people had set things up at Bank Islam. And there were one or two commentators who I became familiar with through the network I grew here in Malaysia, who were writing reasonably intelligently about it. And I won't list the names, but there were people who became personal friends of mine later, worked with me. Professor Dr. Abbas Miracle, who was at the IIiBF, was one of them. And you've got Iqbal Azaria in the UK was another one. All of them have become very, very good friends. But at that time, it was just a very small, tight network. And you ask them completely stupid questions, or I consider them stupid now. And I wouldn't consider them stupid if you asked them now, because, you know, we all went through this learning curve. But, you know, what's the difference? People started explaining riba to me and ribawi items. This is way too complicated. It wasn't until I started understanding concept of risk sharing that things started to move into place. And they started to move in place pretty quickly, because I started getting an understanding, and I used to get answers back saying, follow the Maqasid al-Sharia. I thought, what's that? And it was described as the pathway. So, okay, if there's a pathway, there must be a map. You know, there's no map. Yeah, read the Quran. Okay, but that's a big book. It wasn't until you started talking and things got distilled down that you actually understood some of the basic concepts of the objectives of the Maqasid al-Sharia. And they started resonating with me. I don't know what the reason was, but they made sense. It was sort of common sense. And I then started exploring, and I started reading. And about a year later, I did convert to Islam. Because I just liked it. You know, it just at that time of life, and I was in my early 40s, no, 40, early 40s, 42. And so it was 30 years ago. And I converted to Islam. And I converted to Islam when I was back in the UK. And I went into, anybody know Regent's Park Mosque in London, the mosque in the centre of London? You've heard of that. I walked in there one day, literally walked in, said, I want to convert. A couple of young students were sort of there, because I didn't know what to do. I'd never been inside. Went in there, and a couple of young guys said, oh, you must come see the Mufti. And I went, okay, because they saw me as a sort of middle-aged guy. That's what you do. And they took me to see the Mufti. And the Mufti was an Algerian by birth. And he was a very nice man. He was about my age, but possibly a little older. And he sat me down in his office and said, why? And I explained why I was converting, and the values of this, that, and the other. And he said two things to me, which surprised me. He said, I think your technical understanding of the values of Islam are probably better than most of the congregation here. It's much bit like a. And then he said, "You can convert now." And I said, "But don't I have to do a conversion? You know, don't I have to learn? Oh, you can learn how to pray and do all this stuff. It's what? It's your intention. Your intention." So I converted there and then on the spot. I went, "Wow, this is quite life-changing," and it was. And then I started learning officially. And I'd say gradually during the 90s, I read a little bit more because things were introduced to me. But they were introduced through my network. It wasn't like you go to your website or to the INCIF website or to an IIiBF website or to the Banking Institute or whatever it was in the UK or Bahrain or wherever IIiBF website. Well, IIiBF had started, but there certainly wasn't anything in English. There wasn't much to go and look at, but I found it and I just absorbed it. And I was in consulting and I decided to move out to Asia permanently. I married a Malaysian, and I'm still married to the Malaysian. I have 4 sons. You know, I'm still here, but I moved out to Asia, and in consulting, and I was in banking and finance consulting, there was not a huge amount of opportunity to do what I call Islamic banking consulting in the 90s. I can cite 2 examples, one of which was when I was working for UNICEF. UNICEF was, and I was based in Singapore at the time, UNICEF had won a contract to implement a new banking system into a bank in Pakistan called Muslim Commercial Bank, which I think still exists today. Pretty sure it does, MCB. Muslim Commercial Bank has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? You know, one would have thought, it being Muslim Commercial Bank, that it followed Sharia, that it was an Islamic bank. When I went there to start help doing the setup of the processes to implement Islamic, what I thought was going to be Islamic banking, I went to see the chief operating officer of Muslim Bank, and they didn't do a single bit of Sharia compliant business. It was 1995. Absolutely. I talked to anybody within Muslim Commercial Bank, they were all Muslim. They didn't have a clue about what Islamic banking or finance was about. And what they wanted was a conventional banking system, but they wanted the ability for customers to pay zakat. That was as Islamic as it got. Okay, I'll park that one. I mentioned 2 cases. The second case was after I finished at INCIF. What do they call it? No, UNICEF. INCIF was a lot later. I went to work for a company called IBM Consulting. IBM Consulting was a new organization. It was formed within the massive IBM business machine, computing, whatever it was. I find it a strange experience, but I was asked to go to Saudi, to Riyadh, for one of the Saudi banks to look at how they could modernize their processes to facilitate more retail business around wealth management. And I kind of thought, this was 1996, I had a thought, I tried to read up stuff on the progress of Islamic finance in Saudi, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and sadly I couldn't find much. In fact, there were no financial institutions in Saudi Arabia in the mid-90s that were Sharia compliant at all. Everything was conventional, completely conventional. So I went into this bank and asked a reasonably intelligent question about how, we don't bother that, we just follow, the religion is for everything outside of banking, it's nothing to do with what we're doing here. And the only thing that I noticed different was that there was like a ladies' portion of the bank, which was completely segregated from the men's portion of the bank. And if anything needed to move from one side of the bank, there was a sort of cubby hole thing which would open after somebody knocked with a special code after you put a piece of paper through it in branch. So that was my only exposure to anything that was potentially Islamic. But I read around the subject. And if I fast forward now to 2002, so 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, when I returned to Malaysia, after a 2-year spell setting up a consulting business at Deloitte in Korea, where there was nothing Islamic. But there wasn't much different. And you could get halal food. But that's a different story. In Seoul, there was several halal butchers. I returned to Malaysia, and the first, I won't say the first person I saw, but the first opportunity for me at Deloitte was to support Patmos, who was then heading up something called IIiBF, which had come out of the training department of Bank Islam. And you better ask Patmos the details of that story, because I'll probably get it wrong. As to why Bank Islam kind of maneuvered away from this and abandoned Patmos. IIiBF was set up, but IIiBF was set up. And he said to me, and the managing partner at Deloitte, who was a reasonably close friend of Patmos, why? Well, they both worked together in a predecessor of Deloitte, who's called SGD before them. They both worked together. And also they were both members of the same clan in Kelantan. So I call them the Kelantanese Mafia, with full apologies to anyone in the clan. I don't mean that as a lovely thing, but I call them the Kelantanese Mafia. They talk to they go into the clan. And he needed help. Why? Because he had several projects which he'd won under the Bank Islam training department, which he now couldn't deliver because he had nobody to do it. Well, he had 2 people stayed with him. And he asked Deloitte for help. And I happened to be there. And I said, well, this is interesting. And we sat down and we figured out a way we could help. But we needed to ramp up our skills. So we all did IIiBF training, which was the only thing available to develop talent in 2002. And we then went away to IIiBF, I think, was our first engagement, and showed them how to set up Islamic products within IIiBF. And the snowball started rolling down the hill. I use that example. It shows I'm European and I'm used to winter weather and snow. If you understand how a snowball looks like an avalanche, it rolls down the hill. You're all very smart people. You're very accommodating, but strange people like me grew up in different times. I'm now used to trying to miss it when I'm here. Business started snowballing 2002. By 2003, we were generating enough revenue at Deloitte to be serious. Serious that we got the attention globally, that we were earning a magic number. And I made a proposal to Deloitte at New York, which is like the head office, that we wanted Centre of Excellence certification, which would mean that we'd get research funding and some funding for Centre of Excellence, and that we could grow and develop. And I tried it 3 times. So you can imagine I got rejected 3 times. Why? Because what I was proposing was viewed as terrorist finance. It was terrorist financing because the memories of 9/11 were still very close in mind. And my late grandmother used to say, you can't argue with somebody who's got a sick mind. And senior management was like, full apologies to me, had a sick mind. But you can understand it because they weren't going to wrap their head. What they did notice is the following year, the number I made in revenue grew. Nothing gets people's attention within a business if you start tripling revenues. You basically can ask for anything you want. And in early 2005, we got accredited with Global Centre of Excellence status. And Deloitte Malaysia was the first part of Deloitte Global that had been accredited with Global Centre of Excellence status first part of Asia, the global center of excellence status. It was the first global center of excellence that Deloitte had, which was outside North America and Europe. There were 5 of them. 5 of them. All have gone on to great careers in finance, but we started from about 2003, 2004. And where did we get our knowledge, the talent development? Well, we all went through IIiBF certification. In 2003, that was the only game in town. Well, yeah. Heading it, and there were enough people in Deloitte, because I persuaded the partnership here and a number of people that this is where revenue was going to come from. So please get on board. It wasn't just consulting, it was about tax, it was about audit, it was about corporate finance, it was about the whole gamut, the whole range of products. And I said, there isn't really much training out there. There weren't official courses, there weren't what I would call official, AOP wasn't producing anything at that time. There weren't really any courses at universities that people do, and anyway, that wouldn't ramp you up quickly to get going. IIiBF was the only game in town. And I think over the period of 13 weeks, 2 nights a week and 1 half day on the weekend, we all got certificates in Islamic banking and finance, which gave us the basic grounding. It was the state of the art. 2 years later, when I was appointed first managing director of Hong Kong Islamic Bank, Musk made a public statement, part of his promotion. He's a very modest man, but he said, this man is the best qualified CEO of any Islamic bank. Nobody else had any form of qualification at all, other than conventional banking. And there's this Matsali guy who could wave a piece of paper saying, I've got a new firm certificate. Right. Things really started moving there. And there was a lot of interest in growth and talent development. So I'm looking now in the last 20 years. And I think the highlight of this was the realization that it was moving in Malaysia. You had 2 established Islamic banks. You had the beginnings of windows being created. You had the first sukuk being issued. You had a number of what I would call reasonably well qualified CEOs who come through this through a legal background. You look at, I know there's a representative from IIiBF here because we were talking before. You look at Bucky Shah, legal background, he was the first CEO. He worked at Bank Islam with Musk, the early days. Rafi Hanif took over there, again, legal background. The expertise really came from sukuk structuring, getting involved in the first sovereign sukuks and the sukuk that was issued by Shell were the first deals here. And that experience sort of grew things. And there was a realization, I think, amongst 2 areas. One was the business area. In other words, you guys who are coming from industry were saying, how do we ramp up? IIiBF was clearly doing things, but didn't have a capacity to deal with anybody and everything and everyone all at the same time. It was growing its capacity to do training. But there was some thought about how we could do things to create professional standards. Rather along the lines of the accounting profession. People, I've got a CPA, people have got whatever, various accounting qualifications, but you have to pass exams, you have to hit the standard, you have to maintain your relevance. And the idea was coming that we should have something similar in Islamic banking finance. And INSEAD was the idea was born, the idea was born around 2004. It started physically in 2005. I forget what year your institute started here. Does anybody remember? Yeah, it was around the same time. And a lot of it was clearly coming from the direction of the regulators, particularly Bank Negara, although you should not ignore what the Securities Commission is doing. Because the number of the meetings I had around that time, before I went to Hong Kong Bank, were with countries Arena and with countries Eti. and others, including us, about what we could or should do in terms of developing the right kind of talent. And there was a very clear, I'll call it a mindset, but there was a demarcation at that time between the academic side, where research was needed and you needed to sort of be creative and innovative in your research, but it wasn't necessarily leading to a career path in Islamic banking. Fine.
Yeah, maybe I invite everyone to speak as well. But this is my observation that you mentioned about those speakers, right? I mean, many researchers and scholars you always see the same content.
Yeah.
It's a healthy discussion everywhere. I think you agree with me, right? I don't know. So I think Islam was there for more than 10 years, and IIiBF have been before that. But again, in terms of giving the opportunity to the young, do you think that really you are doing enough of that? Or industry are very resistant towards giving the platform for the young?
It's a great question. Here's what I think. I think when the subsidiary Islamic banks were started around 2005, and I owned them quite, there were two significant steps. One was developing Sharia scholars so that only one Sharia scholar could be on one. Because prior to that, you mentioned Daud Vicary, and that was kind of it. There were a couple of others. Nizam Yakubi was very prominent, and they were sort of the bright young things who were creating stuff. And this created a situation where Sharia scholars needed to be developed, and it was a bit of sort of suck it and see and go 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 2 forward, 1 back. But it changed the mindset about developing younger Sharia scholars. That, in terms of talent development, there was a real recognition that more talent needed to be developed. And IFM was given more of I'll call it free rein, given a push. A lot of industry players were engaged in that. INSEAD started, your own institute started, with a lot of support and a lot of push. But most of it, benefit of hindsight, one thing, but most of it was at the direction of the regulator. Please do this, please set it up. And Baghdara set some very, very strict goals in terms of the amount of business that should be generated, how much talent should be developed as well in terms of getting to certain, I won't call them academic, but professional levels, so on. And if you didn't reach those levels, running an institution, you were fined by the central bank. So yes, it started. The problem was that, in my view, as to why it didn't really embed itself, was that it was still a top-down mentality. The regulator said you must do this. We all jumped, said we were going to do it. And if you didn't do it, you got fined. But it led to a sort of understanding in the industry. And I'm speaking for myself, others can argue. I don't think this was the intention of that, but what they created was nobody was really brave enough to move and take things onto their own account. They were waiting for permission to do it from the regulator. If you compare that, I was at a session last Wednesday, and you were there as well. I'm not sure if you were paying attention at this time, but I remember Jamil was talking about the experience in Indonesia. And this is for a company that we both are associated with that has got operations here in Malaysia and Indonesia. Indonesia is now going great guns on Islamic finance. It's got critical mass, it's got government support, deputy president, all sorts of things going incredibly well. And he answered the question very simply in a way that I would answer the question had I been asked about why, what's different, why I think. Malaysia got off to a rapid head start. Why? Because it was honed from the top. That the regulations were there, you were supposed to do this and whatever else. What happened in Indonesia, all grassroots. I mean, I remember trying to deal with authorities, the equivalent of the Securities Commission, the central bank, even before it came OJK, trying to deal with them. They were all over. There was no centralized control. Now you've got this massive groundswell of the people that are up with a good understanding of how all this stuff works. Why? Because they spent 20 years educating and training. And now they're moving forward. What you have here, and again, this is my personal thing, what you have here in Malaysia is still there is a certain expectation that the government and the regulators should lead and will follow. And that's not their intention. That's not their intention. Maybe I'll come on to that a little bit later. How are we doing for time? Maybe I'm going to stop here because I could talk about the past forever, and I want to get on to the present. Are there any questions from the floor? Please don't be shy. I'll be in.
Anything you want to share? Prophet Sarina is doing works on Indonesia very closely. They have for Islamic advisory of MBA as well.
Don't feel pressure. If you want to open up. Not, yeah. I'm not letting you off the hook, but feel free. I work a lot better when people ask me.
We can hear from industry side. I mean, how do you see this? Who is developing from IIiBF?
I think we have the test just now right out. I guess my concern now is because I'm coming from a space of talent management. We then close the gap of I know that there's a part that is still what's the same time but exporting talent. We're trying to brainstorm the party. We've done a lot of those, many sessions, but this is it's not a specific issue with
That's a great question. Perhaps you could put on the next slide just to show we're progressing. The plane still keeps moving and sort of looking at the present. And that's just sort of give you a visual. That is a great question. Let me try and answer that. In that, if you look at things that are micro, in other words, the stuff that you at CIMB can do under your control, and there's macro, which is at regulator level, government policy, and even global policy and standards. And I'll refer back to STARS framework. If you look at the micro stuff, this is what you can do within CIIB, and I'm sure you're doing it. I'm reasonably familiar with what you're doing. I'm not the detail that you have, but I talk to senior people at CIIB from time to time, and I meet your board members as well. You can only do what you can do within that space, and I think your bank is doing reasonably well at that in terms of talent development. It's about having clarity about where you want to go as a bank, the 2B thing. That's the senior level strategic decision about where you want to play and how you want to play it. Is it local? Is it international? I can't give opinions on that, but there needs to be a clear strategy. And that strategy needs to be translated into, well, what are we expecting to do with our people? You'll be looking at the churn of your people just, leaving because they want more money. They're not particularly interested in the career. They just want money. There are people who are looking to develop a career and are likely to stay a bit longer. How do you retain those people who are, at the leading edge and make sure that they've got exciting and interesting opportunities for them? And that may be through job rotation. It may be through putting them through different departments or even different geographic locations, so on and so forth. I'm sure you're doing all of that. And you're probably looking at processes whereby people are mentored by, and you have sort of uncles and aunties or whatever the equivalent is there. And these are all things that have been around for 20 or 30 years. I worked for a consulting firm in the 90s. For a very brief time before I joined Deloitte, it was a French firm. It's now owned by Ernst & Young. It's called Capgemini. They had an absolutely fantastic process for onboarding people and mentoring and monitoring them. So much so that, you know, if I was a reasonably senior person responsible for young people coming in under my authority and I was mentoring them, that was part of my goal. If they failed, I failed. I didn't get the marks. And that really focused the attention on the mentoring process. I speak a great deal now about how important that mentoring process is. And the mentoring still goes on. You know, I use the words retirement. A lot of what I do is mentoring. And it's not formal mentoring processes. It's people who I've worked with and been associated with, you know, over a period of years for a variety of reasons. And one member of the audience here, Mufti, I'm sure you don't mind, but was a student of mine at INSEAD. And we remained in touch because he did there was an opportunity for him to do some work for the government, for Country Zeti, and I felt he was the best person there, and he did that work. And Country Zeti was extremely pleased with it, and we've remained in contact ever since. It was an important area of development. It was a paper she was writing for the RFI Foundation on Islamic finance and sustainability. And the mentoring process is ongoing. In fact, he sent me some stuff earlier this week for me to sort of tick boxes and explain what my views were on that. That mentoring process, I think, is critical, and setting that up within the organisation. The macro, it's a lot more challenging because you don't have control over it. Yeah, a lot of it is political, and I don't want to go into the politics of it, but you know, you've got the politics of the country. And where they want to go, where they want to generate revenue, where they see the opportunity. Certainly, in the time that I was appointed to be president of INSEAD in 2011, and INSEAD was under the auspices of Bank Negara, the governor was chairman of the board in her public capacity as governor of Central Bank. But in her private capacity, she was also appointed as chancellor of the university. I think no, that's right. No. Thanks for attending so long. Sure. You've got better things to do. And she was appointed chancellor in her own right. And there was a very strong, she was a strong leader. And after cabinet every week, there was a financial something or other committee that was held every week. I think it was Thursdays, actually. Thursday seems to be a magic day. And from time to time, I was asked to present to the majority of the cabinet and the likes of Country Outland Wall there as part of Qatar. And my advice or input was sought on talent development and on what we were doing at INSEAD and how we were progressing Malaysia as a national financial centre, so on, from my perspective. And under Country Zeti's leadership, a lot of stuff that perhaps wouldn't have got on the agenda politically did get on the agenda politically at that time. Whether it was played out or not was, you know, is another matter. But it's very difficult, you know, to move this. I notice now that we've reactivated the sort of senior governing council for the MISC, which Country Outland is chairing, which is vital. I mean, he's a good guy, good brain, and he gets stuff done. He's also chairing the board at INSEAD now, and he's on the board at Daud Vicary. Maybe other things I've missed out there. But he's back in play and he's highly influential. But there are lots of what I would call infrastructural things which take a longer time. You know, what is the policy in terms of general talent development within Malaysia? We're seeing people leaving the country for a variety of reasons, not so many people coming in. We're certainly seeing, you know, when I first came here, occasionally on visits. And when I first started here on a work permit in late 90s, when I moved here with Deloitte, a lot of what I would call more senior jobs were given to expats, rightly or wrongly, but there was a policy that said you can't get a renewal of your work permit because you're expected to train a local person to take over. How well that was applied 20 years ago, I have to doubt. I'm still there, but I got the residency. Because apparently I'm fighting for national interest, but Bank Negara put me here because of what I was doing in Islamic finance. But the attraction of coming to Malaysia, there are attractions, but there aren't so many what I would call expat packages now. So it's local packages, and when people sort of compare dollar to dollar, the packages aren't that good. It's when you go into the detail when you realise that health and education and food and whatever else, even though you may think it's but relatively speaking, it's not as expensive as other things. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm honoured to have been made a permanent resident from late 2007, so 15 and a half years now. I have what I call a duty of care. To mentor and to give back and to be associated. Malaysia has given me great opportunity, which I hope I take as best I could. I have no plans to go anywhere else. My expertise is broadly around Islamic finance, so it's getting more around sustainability, and I'm quite interested with the fintech stuff, and I'm engaged with that. That's because I'm old and retired, and I can dabble in things that people said no to years ago when I was official position. But I believe that it's about giving back, sharing, and interacting. But policy-wise, it's a very, very competitive area where Malaysia can make differences now, where the buzz, and we're talking here about Islamic finance or the Islamic economy. 20 years ago, the MIFC and what Malaysia was doing, and how it was growing, and there was a lot of opportunity, and Malaysia did pretty well at it, and was sort of top of the list, and everybody wanted to knock Malaysia off, the top. And then I would say it's probably in the last 10 years that I would say we've lost our way a little bit, that kind of drive and the focus that we did see, which was supported by regulators or encouraged by regulators, and certainly supported by government, isn't there anymore. And it's probably moved on to, and the next big opportunity is around the sustainability thing. That's a separate discussion. But don't forget that Islam, the Maqasid Sharia, the concept that we should be using in Islamic finance are very, very relevant to sustainability. I was fortunate, I think, probably from, I'll call it 10 years ago, of being a bit more switched on to the sustainability issue than others were. For no other reason than it just was the topic of conversation that a few people with like minds were talking about and what we could do about it. But I do recall, and I think I may have shared this with Mufti, after I've been into the year or two, Bank Negara suggested that we lead a conversation with the Sharia scholars in Malaysia at Bank Negara on what they saw as their role as Sharia scholars, given not the SDGs weren't around there, but what was happening around ERG or sustainability. And we ran a series of afternoon workshops, I think, during a week. We ran it 3 times. It was probably Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We saw 40 Sharia scholars. And the reaction, this is 2012, let's say 10 years ago, the reaction from the Sharia scholars there, and I'm just reporting the fact, was this has nothing to do with us. I'm summarising it. They didn't say this has nothing to do with us, but they were saying, we're Sharia scholars, we look at the applicability of the contract and the structure of the contract. And nobody was talking about the, you know, I gave an example. Okay, so you've got an Ijara contract, a lease for a Caterpillar bulldozer, and the usage of that bulldozer is it's going to plough through 2 hectares of rainforest in Sarawak. Yeah, is that Sharia compliant? And I kind of got blank looks back.
Maybe if I can add a bit on that, I had an opportunity to speak with Rafi. Okay, I had a session like this. You were saying about moving from Sharia compliant from halal to oil, from negative spending to positive spending. So maybe the direction now would be very different, but now you see the focus now on the climate change kind of thing. Maybe there's, I mean, higher interest now think towards that. Yeah, the direction was in 2012. Maybe that was preliminary reaction.
Yeah. And I mean, they were technically very proficient and grown a lot since 2005, but they hadn't been told this is what they were supposed to be doing. You know, again, it was the direction thing. Now I think the direction is much more on looking at it, and you see certainly my interactions with scholars now, which are still fairly fruitful, and particularly the younger ones. I call them the upcoming scholars, where Daud Vicary, he and I were young. Oh yeah. You know, they're switched on and they're conscious of this stuff. And there's also a lot of toolkits out there which will help. You know, if you're looking, you know, Bank Islam has got, it uses, they've got a sort of ESG assessment tool. And I looked at it years and years ago when I was deployed second time. What's it called?
Is it?
No, I mean, they've taken the product and they actually run it and they've set up here and it'll come back. But it's, yeah, there are a lot of tools out there which take this. There are a lot of, you know, analytical. And this is an area where I'm still sort of answering your question or trying to, that, you know, the development is you know, changing the data into action, you know, and that takes, you know, turning the data into something that you can interpret, creating knowledge, but then turning into wisdom and creating the customer experience. So it's about collecting, you know, the right kind of data. And you IIiBF or anybody else, it is a real challenge because you mentioned, you remember I talked about micro things. The macro stuff, you don't have much control over. Other than that, you can do things well in your own environment and just put it out there. And if it's any good, people will follow. And it's this experiment of what I call rapid prototyping and teaching people that it's okay to fail. I think, you know, if I look back now on my brief spell with, I'll call it academia or education. I'm not an academic. All I got is a bachelor's degree and I don't have the brain power. It's about how you educate people to fail and to accept failure. I can cite lots of stories here. I'm not saying we must educate more people to fail and not pass their exam. Not what I'm saying. I think you do understand what I hope you understand what I'm saying. Is that it's okay to go and try stuff and experiment with it. It's like there were games in arcades years ago. Does anybody remember something called Whack-A-Mole? No? This is an arcade game where you had moles sticking their heads up from underneath the ground. And you had a hammer in the arcade and you put in your 50 cents and you whack, and you whack their heads in. Now, culturally, I can say this as a non-Malaysian. Culturally, Malaysia, in my, when did I first start that coming? Mid-80s, so 90s. 90, 0 to 10, or 40 years I've been coming here. Malaysia, culturally, has a whack-a-mole culture. That sticking your head up and saying, I think we should try and do things this way, particularly if you're young, and particularly if you're a lady, you get whacked. So what happens once you've got a sore head? And I'm generalising. I don't think this is as bad today as it was 30 years ago. But culturally, we need to do more to get our young people to come up and suggest the idea and to innovate and for them to be listened to and to be mentored in that way. It's not all in the heads of the board members or the C-level or the senior management. Some of it may be, don't knock the experience. The experience is useful, but they need to have a much more open-minded, mindset of how they grow and develop the young people, and that they're a great thing. But the great experience I had in consulting as a partner at Deloitte, and I think the lifelong learning I got from that is that I joined Deloitte as a direct entry partner. I didn't go through and up, which could be pretty rapid. What impressed me at Deloitte was the way in which partners interact with young people, because their job was to ensure that these young people were the future of the firm and get them there as quickly as they're ready to be there. And your job was to mentor and I remember meetings on team meetings when I was a partner leading on a project, you had everybody in the room and everybody had free reign to ideas. Anybody could come up and you said, that's a great idea, why don't we try it? And you go away and try it, didn't work, okay. You didn't criticize them, you said, that didn't work. Do we know why? Okay, let's move on and do it. You were rapid prototype. And I don't know if you have that rapid prototyping culture within CIIB. That's something that you need to have a lot more of in terms of curriculum development and the appropriateness that you have as a university to the program that's going on out there, all the business that's going on out there. That needs to be there. But it's difficult because you've got regulation around you which says, I don't know how quickly you can make a change to a curriculum. When I was at INSEAD, the minimum it would take would be a year, to get a change, major change to a program with the Ministry of Higher Education. I don't know what it takes now. There are reasons for that. And I'm not saying it's a free-for-all because you've got to set standards, but we ought to be able to adapt much more quickly, to that process.
Maybe if you can share a bit on how the mentoring process. That's the situation that Mr. Daud Vicary mentioned that happened in consulting companies. I remember myself, I joined as a young graduate at a KPMG. I have the direct access to the tech. I was looking at tech, but we sit together in a meeting room and developing some of the material together. But you have that kind of environment that banking institutions or some banking institutions. There you go.
Building down
was that taught by late Sir Ken Robinson, who was explaining about how he was convinced everyone that why schools tend to kill creativity among kids because of this culture. That you sometimes you have to tell kids that it's okay to be wrong sometimes, right? Yes, I think that's the point that
But how would explain when the yes or no, you're not sure. Fail, or that's what you do. That it's how that. So that's a lot. So how- I'm not saying that it's not that, but I think when it's
This is, perhaps when you put the next slide up as well, because there's nothing out there, this is sort of morphing into how do we tackle today and how do we move forward with this. I'm old enough to remember, and I'm sure there are some of you still, you remember the culture of sort of jobs for life, that you join an organization. I remember after I graduated, I joined a British bank called Lloyds Bank, still around today. And I remember when I was expressing concerns about my future career development with the bank, they viewed it very negatively in that, you know, where else are you going to go where you were going to get these kind of opportunities? And it was like an act of disloyalty that you should even be contemplating, you know, leaving, and that I was a fast track and I was performing, whatever else. And there was a bit of what I would call peer pressure from within the bank. And I was considering moving from a British bank to an American bank. I got more pressure from my parents, who were, you know, even older school than I am. You know, they're brought up, they were young kids during the Great Depression. There was a world war going on, you know, all sorts of shortages. My dad only worked in one job. He joined up with the Royal Navy when he was 18, and he retired from the Royal Navy and then went into the Ministry of Defence. And my mum had done, you know, secretarial jobs like that. When I mentioned the idea of leaving Lloyds Bank, a respectable bank, and that and the other, and going to work for an American bank, it was just like shock horror, absolute shock horror. I went ahead and did it anyway, but and they were, you know, very pleased when I, you know, did well there and moved on. But initially they were just very apprehensive about moving on. So it was a cultural thing. I think there's a trend starting to happen now, and I'll share with you what that trend is and how I think it's going to play out. The trend is now that what's attractive to young people who've got the skill, and who understand that rapid prototyping is the way to go forward, is they're not going to join CIMB. They're not going to join any large organization. They might join a top-notch consulting firm, you know, who've done quite a bit of thinking about this. But they might do that. But then the question they're raising today, they didn't raise it 20 years ago, is that I'm not going to get practical experience. I'm going to get project-related experience with various, which is useful. But I'm not going to get the practical experience of joining a fintech startup, for example, where you do get the rapid prototyping, and half of these companies fail, but they fail fast and people move on and they've learned their skills, and people are actually actively looking for people who've gone through the failure process. Because I can tell you now, at the age of my 72nd year, where did I learn the most? When I made mistakes and I screwed up. Yeah. You know, where I made errors of judgment or I made the wrong decision, or whatever, and it's all on board there, and I can sort of catalogue. And I was the better for making the decision. By playing it safe, I'm sure I wouldn't have got to where I got to, whatever that is. You know, I'm happy with my life and I've enjoyed doing what I'm doing, and it's been quite adventurous. And you know, I've moved country, I've changed religion, and I'm sort of, you know, I'm still active doing things because that's how I am. So I think, you know, one thing is that this whole thing now is playing out by people joining interesting startups. And that is, there's an element of personality about that, because the startups have usually a pretty engaging or interesting personality who started them up, either because they're socially media aware and sort of play, you know, and play that game, or they're technically very proficient in their game, and that is an intellectual challenge to a young person saying, I really want to learn from this person because I'm prepared to sit down with them. How is this going to play out? Well, clearly, you're not going to have the whole world joining startups, but you are going to see more and more startups, and you're going to see sort of micro businesses. And I forget the numbers, but is it more than 8? We've got economists in the room, so you'll put me wrong, but I have a feeling that, you know, more than 80% of the Malaysian economy is based on SME. Am I about right? I thought it might be, but I was going to risk 90. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. And I think what the challenge is how you build that credibility, because the systems around, I'll go back to start there, is geared up for anything above an SME. Yeah, larger companies, whatever else. Can SMEs get funding and financing? Bit of a challenge. Can individuals get it? How, you know, how does the system promote this? And this is a dilemma that the government in Malaysia and other countries are having right now, is how do you actually get effective financing and channel the right resources into promoting this growth area? The the COVID situation here, as indeed many countries, has provided, although it's been horrendous for people who suffered a lot as a result of it, and they have both prayers and sympathy from my part, but it's also opened the doors of opportunity to think about how you do things in a different way. And now's not the time to say, well, how does IIiBF meet this challenge? But pre-COVID, pretty much 90% of your staff came into work every day. 10%, may have been off doing other things. Now, and my eldest son has just started working for IIiBF a couple of weeks ago. And I said, how's it going? And he said, well, it's quite interesting. He said, I won't tell you his specialization. He said, I only have to show up at the office 3 times or 4 times a month. Is it 3 or 4? I'm not. It's very flexible. So I went, oh, wow. And I said, well, how do you get to know your other team members? He said, well, I'm going into the office to find them, but we're organizing something about, I mean, he's mid-level, whatever. I don't know what the gradings are. I don't, I'm glad he's got a job and he's doing something he enjoys. But that's a big change from, 2 or 3 years ago. It was incomprehensible that you didn't go to your place of work. And now, most of the work I do now, and I'm fortunate because I retired in 2017, retired from full-time employment. But most of what I started doing in 2017, 2018 was online Zoom. And I hope those that are on Zoom, I'll wave at them now. Sorry, I ignored you for that. And you better ask if there are any questions coming from my Zoom call. So let's get to that. I adapted because I retired, and that's how I was conducting my business. So when COVID happened, I didn't have to recalibrate at all. It was just, okay, this is the way it's done, and you just get better and better at doing it. Now that we can interact, and I'm 72 this year, I like interacting with people. It's fun, it's challenging, it gives you a chance to sort of express yourself and to learn other people's points of view and what's going on. How do you replace that? For me at 72, it's a bit more of a challenge than somebody who's 16 or 18 or 20 who's got used to it and they've got all sorts of different apps. I'm no fool with this thing for somebody who's 72. But the kind of stuff that I have 4 boys, the oldest is 38, 39, the youngest is now 24. You know, they think I'm a complete dinosaur. Yeah. They just go, "Hiya, you're a dinosaur." You know, why don't you learn that? You know. When I started in banking, we didn't have computers. We wrote stuff down. We did the accounting hand posted ledgers. This is the late 1960s when I was at school and I worked summer job. We didn't have computing in the branch. Everything was manual. Everything was absolutely manual. So I do okay with this stuff. But the new generation is very, very used to it, and they interact and they have their own way of doing, the social dynamics. So the future for me looks as if, if you're at the IIiBF, and I have shared this with some of your board members, I don't know whether they listen to me, but it's difficult to change the direction of a big ship. You have to be looking at what you want your business to be. Much more of it, particularly your retail business, is going to be about the customer experience, and it isn't going to be face-to-face experience. It's going to be this or whatever the next generation is. So you have to be thinking about how you give first-rate customer experience, and that you've got to have people who can develop the technology, people who can think about the creativity about how you market and how you take this stuff forward and hit your target audience. Remember, your target audience, you're going to get the young people, but what about the middle-aged and older people who aren't used to you? You've still got to accommodate them. And you've got to think about, is it worth my while in investing so all of this is in-house? 20 years ago, and I know this because I work, IIiBF had its own system, and it, in order to grow and develop, it bought a new software product and put it on its own system. Now, you've probably got much more stuff going on in the cloud. That's in 20 years. So more and more of this kind of experience is going to be out there in the cloud, but it's going to be people. And maybe you have a product innovation department who are a world-class product innovation department who just churn out ideas on this stuff, but you just tap into them because you're funding them, but you don't own them. And culturally, the large organizations have to figure out how they rapidly prototype this, and they become a brand, and they become a customer experience, but actually they're interacting with lots of cogs around the world. And can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So what do you do? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm almost sort of with that. Go back. Oh, okay. I'll try. Yeah, go ahead. No. Red light.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daud, and Your Excellency, respective from lecture. It's a rare story. Also a very, very expensive experience. And also it reminds me about the book with the topic, The Winners Take All. Maybe you have heard about the Winners Take All. And it is almost similar, the story about yourself and also your experience. My question is, the first question, what was your constructual thinking to be a pioneer? Maybe I can say it is a pioneer because you said you cannot find any, reference, especially during the 90s. And then what was your contractual thinking to be a pioneer, especially in Islamic finance field? And then what was your motive at that time? So you are able to be a pioneer in your field, and so you can spend your time. You spend your time for Islamic finance field. And then the third question: have you ever failed in your field? And what is the story, or maybe what is the most experience about failing in the Islamic finance field?
And then the fourth question is, sorry, I think in your example in 72, is there anything that you still want to achieve, but maybe you still feel stuck or maybe stop? And what was the factor? Actually, it reminds me about what you said about start, and it is all about the opportunity. That is why you establish your company in Malaysia instead of in another country. And then there are many points that very interesting. It's like how to, how you like interact with people, and then customer experience, and then how to educate people to fail. That's very interesting point. And then the last question is, what is the leader in your perspective? Thank you so much. I think
A lot of questions, who is the leader or what is it?
I think what is the leader in your perspective? Thank you so much.
Okay. There's a lot of stuff there, but I think they're all there. I'll try and deal with each of them, but briefly. Others may want to ask questions. The first two questions about, what was in my mind, what was the concept, why did I do this at the time? The answer, and I have to be very honest, it was purely selfish. I needed money. I needed to get employed, and I was a freelancer, and this seemed to be an area where somebody wanted to pay me money to go out and find out about it. But I got into it, and it was enjoyable. I enjoyed the people I met. I liked the values of what they were doing, how they were doing it, and things just rolled from there. So I always describe myself as an accidental tourist. I just showed up at the right place at the right time. My dear brother and friend, Professor Dr. Abbas Miracle, has a slightly different view of me. He's known me almost since the beginning of my time in Islamic. He worked very closely with me when I was at INSIT. He was the chair of Islamic banking, as most of you know. He was the most senior person outside the managing director. He was the most senior member of faculty of the IIiBF, and was one of the few members of the IIiBF who agreed with the Mahathir on how to deal with the Asian crisis. He said to me, because we used to talk every day about stuff, and he said, you were a very quick study. You learn things very quickly. You have an open mind, and you think about stuff, not to knock it down because it doesn't fit within your framework, but you're quite happy for a framework to be rebuilt. And he said, you're a very, very quick study on this, and that you were cool. Have you ever thought about it that way, that your conversion to Islam was right time, right place? And I said, yes, you're probably right. It was, a number of circumstances happening with me personally and professionally that I adapted to. So there was no great sort of revelation or I've got to sit down and do this stuff. It was just, there was an opportunity presented, and my education and upbringing and family situation was that if opportunities present themselves, you go and explore very, very quickly. That was just, just the way it is, which is surprising. I was educated at the second oldest school in England, Norwich School, founded in the year 1092. So there's a long tradition of education there. That means I could be very conservative or old-fashioned, which I'm not. So I think that answers your first two questions. Your third question was about what? Your third question was about failure. There's so many, but where do I start? But you wanted failures around Islamic finance or around?
Yeah, in the most story in terms of Islamic finance, or maybe Islamic finance.
Well, no, I mean, look, I'll try and keep it on Islamic finance, but things happen here. I recall one instance, and I'd been at Hong Kong Islamic Bank, set it up for about a year, and there was there was a concern in the whole marketplace about the legitimacy or the Sharia compliance of certain instruments and certain constructs. And there was a legal case, and all of a sudden, my chairman, Country Queck, decided to shut down all of my auto financing because he didn't like the risk, as was demonstrated by this legal case that was going on at the time. And my failure, there were two failures I had. One was I didn't anticipate the outcome of this legal case and think that this may have an impact on my chairman. And I hadn't managed his expectations. And the second thing was that it was, I failed Islamic finance in general because a large proportion of my book was on auto financing, which I'd inherited from the window operation. And as a result, I was exposed. And I'd let down the staff and I'd let down the business. And we were running off the existing business, but we weren't taking money. The customers weren't a concern. And the failure was that the bank, unless I created some new product or something to replace the business, because the chairman shut this business down, that the expectation was that I'd still do the same profit, the same numbers. Just like I don't like the risk of the business profit. And I just thought I'd failed. And I very nearly, we had a process in Hong Kong, Islamic Bank, which is sort of a very, if you're not in Hong Kong, you probably don't go to anything similar. It's called the QSBS, Quarterly Strategic Business Meeting, where effectively you were in front of your peers and other CEOs and the chairman and board, and you had to report on your numbers and your performance and what was going wrong and what was going right. And it was very, very intense. I was never reduced to tears, but I remember two chief financial officers of the banking group being reduced to tears as a result of the intensity of this meeting. They were completely unforgiving. I very nearly, given this situation that was coming up, I very nearly resigned on the spot. I didn't, and I'm glad, and it was the making. But I really thought I'd failed in terms of the way I managed it, in the fact that I hadn't recognized that there may be a risk in running this business, and that I didn't actually have an alternative. But as it turned out, adversity sparked the creativity, and we actually generated other products. We did things like that. But the failures sometimes come from when you don't think it's, you think you're going along very nicely, and then all of a sudden something just changed the dimension. Third question is what did I, what what the last one was leaders. So what do I still want to achieve in a time? Oh, what keeps me going is one is the fact that I don't have to, well, in this day and age, you don't have to go to the office, but I used to, when I went to INSEAD, I've always been an early starter. I was at my desk at INSEAD by 6:30, 6:45 every morning. Why? Because I just wanted to be there and I wanted to do stuff. And I got, as a result of arriving early, I got maybe an hour or 2 hours of quiet time where I could sort of think and sort out all the stuff. The rest of the day was just interaction, meetings, doing stuff. I don't have to do that now. I still get up early, but I don't have to go to the office, which is an absolute luxury. But I still have a routine of doing things. And I have email and the social media. I still write a bit. I work on the board, advisory boards and boards of a number of companies. And I have, at the moment, I have 3-page contracts. I have had more in the past, and I'm still open. But the contracts are, one is I work for a UK-based company involved in Islamic finance, but developing their sustainability policy. we've been doing it for 4 or 5 years, and that's very interesting and engaging. Another contract is actually with ISRA, and I'm contracted to deliver and moderate on what's called the Islamic Finance Board members, which is the Bank Negara program. Every board member of every Bank Negara financial institution has to attend the program and pass. So I moderate it and do it. And we don't do it so often now. I think this year we're doing 2, but in the past we've done 12, one every month. But that's an interesting area. The third area where I'm working on is that I'm doing some paid advisory work. I'm on the board of a fintech company which is in the area of digitization, tokenization, and borderless trading, which I find a very, very stimulating area. And I'm working with a young scholar in the UK, Mufti Farad Adam, who I think we know to some of you. He's a very, very sharp young scholar who I enjoy working with because he's very business focused. You know, he understands the issues of the business, and he's learning as he goes along, and I'm learning as I go along. And I think what keeps me going on this is that I may be 72 this year, but I'm still learning. And I think the opportunity is, if you're still learning, you've also got the opportunity to give back. I love doing sessions like this. I love, you know, smaller groups or whatever it is, where just you're mentoring, you're just having a conversation, and you're just, you know, sharing, you know, the skills and knowledge you have. What is the leader? Well, I don't think you're really talking about leadership quality. Is that what you're asking?
I mean, maybe the style, how is it your?
I don't think there's a sort of one size fits all style. I think it depends on the circumstance. Sorry, this is a bit of consulting thing. Depends, you know, that gives you a lot of attitude after it. My style is different from others. I've been reasonably successful. I've been appointed into leadership positions since my, let's go back, since I was about 40, you know, so for the last 30 something years. Was I worthy of them? I think so. And I got better at it. And I have a particular style. I manage by walking around. I give you an example. When I joined INSEA in 2011, I interviewed in the first 2 weeks, I interviewed every single member of staff, 120, some faculty, some operational, cleaning ladies, drivers, everybody, met everybody. And I wanted to get across to them what I was going to do and how I was going to do it and how important their role. Yeah, keeping the place clean, making sure you show up on time as a driver and get people, you know, the senior people around. So it was just an interaction. The feedback I got initially was the junior people were actually terrified of coming to be the president, CEO. And I said, why? They said, well, your predecessor, he never stepped outside his office. And I discovered after I'd interviewed everybody, about 60% of the staff had never met the president, and he'd been there 6 years. And so, yeah, but his leadership was fine in the way he did it. I'm not criticizing, it's just different from my staff. I managed by walking around. I would walk around a minimum, the whole campus, and go into every room 2 times a day if I'm from the country. Minimum, might be more. And I'd interact with staff, ask them how they were, you know, if I knew a bit more about them, which I would do, you know, how their kids were doing. Some were going to university, some were getting married, some were this, that, and the other. You make it as personal as possible. What's interesting now is I have a database, thanks to social media and whatever else. My ex-staff from the time that I came back to Deloitte here 20 odd years ago, I've got their birthday and I remember their birthday. And I send them a note, how they're doing, and you stay in touch. That's my leadership style. And that works for me because I make it as personable as possible. And people remember me, and they remember me. Now I'm at an age where I'm not embarrassed to sort of share feedback about me. I think younger, I'm a little bit, oh, no, I don't want to. the most positive responses are about my, being available to enter and the feedback I've given, the honest feedback I've given them, how it's helped develop their careers and, where they are now. And that's very, very hard. And it's for me, it's the duty of care. I'm going to keep doing this for as long as I'm physically capable of doing it. I hope I get invited back, or I hope I get, similar opportunities somewhere else just to interact. I hope that gives you some, a good set of questions. We doing okay for time?
Maybe just like last point, during our, maybe I can share a bit during our pre-talk discussion. So we're talking about the importance for young minds to adopt the principle, the first principle approach that happened outside finance. Like Bill Gates was, and he quoted, he was saying that we don't need banks, but we need banking. So maybe you can share a bit on that.
Yeah, I'm somewhere. There's another question there. Let's see if we can.
I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Economics at IIiBF. I'm from Bosnia originally. I have like a few questions, but perhaps I'll try to connect them. They're related. One is, I captured that saying of yours, you were mentioning that riba is not really a good way of starting to explain what Islamic finance is all about. I would be very interested to know how would you approach to explain Islamic banking, finance, Islamic economics, and then it relates to the next question related to the general kind of perception of talent about Islamic banking, finance, Islamic economics. That what is the difference from the conventional banks, finance institutions, conventional economics? They would usually say that it becomes more expensive if you wish to, let's say, buy a house, or if you wish to acquire financing compared to the Islamic banking finance. So they have that kind of mindset of perhaps I wouldn't really bother much about which institution I join and which banking finance I do. So how could we explain to them, in your view, why Islamic banking finance is important? Because I perceive that they really need to first understand why is it important. And it relates again to the third and last question. Do you perceive that one's identity, clarification of one's identity, now speaking about Muslims, new talents, Muslims who would be perhaps, I mean, with a probability more interested in Islamic banking, finance, Islamic economics than others. So do you think that it plays a role for them to clarify the question of why am I Muslim, since you have had that process of clarification, and how to deal with, well, how did you deal with your experience and education skills you acquired in the conventional banking, finance, economics field, legislation and STARS elements. Later on, when you joined and went deep into the ocean of Islamic banking, finance industry and did much to develop it. So I hope you capture it. Yeah, thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Great for the question. How long have I got?
5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes, and then we're wrapping up. Okay. I'll remember the Bill Gates quote and see if I can come back to that.
It's okay.
I've got that quote. The first question: how do I explain Islamic banking finance? But I've been in this for 30 years, and for probably 10, 11 years, I tried to explain it around riba. It's not an easy place to start because the whole system is based on riba. And when you try to explain that, how do you make a profit without charging interest? The whole mentality is geared against you. I had when I was a partner at Deloitte in the late 90s, my boss, American, he was Jewish. And he did have some understanding. He wasn't a finance expert. He graduated from MIT in electrical engineering and then went on to Harvard Business MBA. And he was fascinated by Islamic finance and still is. And he's 10 years older than me, so he's in his early 80s now. And he's very interested, and he drew similarities with what he'd learned, you know, in his Jewish studies or, you know, from the Torah. And of course, there are huge similarities between Islam or the Abrahamic faith, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism in terms of the economic side of it. And I'm not going to go into that because it will take me through it. It's a topic I absolutely love and uplift, and I sit down and talk about it for hours every week. And it's a large part of his PhD thesis, which he's working on. That'll be another session. He and I will be doing about that. But I learned a way of trying to explain it in one sentence, which started an engaging conversation. And the first time I remember using it in public was in May 2005 at the opening ceremony of the launch for the new Islamic bank, Hong Kong Islamic Bank, which was now becoming a full-fledged subsidiary. And the governor came and the chairman was there. We had a big, you know, thing. And then there was a press conference. And a lady from the media, I think it was Malaysian media, yes, she was, asked me the question, you know, many of our readers, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, have no comprehension whatsoever. This was 2005, what Islamic finance is. You know, many people feel it's interest-free banking, so they get the idea they can borrow money and they don't have to pay interest back, or they don't have to pay anything back. Yeah, I get the direction. And I had one of these sort of blinding flashes of light in my head, which I get occasionally, because I didn't know what the answer was. But it came out, and I still use it. And I'll repeat this a couple of times, so you may want to jot it down, but I find it very useful. It is this. Islamic finance is about the effective use of capital and effective and economic use of capital for the benefit of the real economy. Islamic finance is the efficient and effective mobilization of capital for the benefit of the real economy. And that usually gets me into an interesting conversation about what the real economy is. And I can talk about sustainability and, you know, not what I would call the false economy and the trading economy, the fabricated economy there. And it also is about the efficient use and mobilization of capital. Because Islam encourages you to use your wealth and your money, whether it be social finance, whether you're paying zakat, or whether you're giving sadaqah or creating waqf, whatever else. It's about risk sharing. It's about using your money effectively to create more wealth. The reason you give zakat is that you hope the person receiving zakat will be in a position to pay zakat in the future. Okay. So that's what I use to explain. Now I can go on from that. A lot of stories you can tell about how it works, but riba is a bad place to start because it assumes that the person listening to you has got some understanding there's an alternative system to a capitalist system using interest. Okay. It gets interesting when you talk to Christians and Jews who perhaps have long forgiven that it is actually a mortal sin. It's forbidden to use interest or riba, or whatever they call it. You know, if you're a Jew, you cannot bear witness. In other words, you have no right to citizenship as a Jew. If you're a Christian, if you deal in riba, you cannot be buried in consecrated ground. Basically means you go straight to hell. Okay, we kind of lost that. In Islam, we still persist. However, we do have work to do to get across the values. The second question, you know, the main difference. Now, I've explained a little bit of it there, but how do you do that? The problem is you either try to create a completely secure ring-fence system, which has been tried in Sudan, Pakistan twice, Iran. I think they kind of got it to the you probably know better than I. I'm a bit slow on my economic history updates, but that hasn't worked. Why? Well, because the economies are isolated. So we have to play within the bigger system, and the bigger system has a number of forms. You know, the money transfer system by large SWIFT. Yeah, every Islamic Islamic Bank uses SWIFT. But the moment you use SWIFT, you become haram. Why? Because SWIFT charges you interest if you don't deliver or pay on time. But every Islamic bank is using the system. You know, I don't want to get into a debate as to is Islamic banking in Malaysia haram or not. That's the second one. You bright guys can figure that out. But where I'm coming from is that we've still got work to do. It's because we haven't created it. But the opportunities are certainly going to be there. You know, the differences are around. If you're looking at specific, I would look at it from the use of capital. You know, under the Basel Committee, in a conventional bank, you have to allocate certain proportions of capital in your balance sheet to do various things that satisfy regulatory requirements. If you follow that route as an Islamic bank, you also have to, but in fact, there are ways around it legitimately where you don't have to deploy that capital in the same way, and you can create risk, okay, which people may find attractive. Now, you won't get your deposits insured by the IIiBF or whatever the equivalent is. But so long as people understand that they are taking a risk, education required there are huge opportunities. And this is where the Daud Vicary campaign trying to what's it called? What is banking at ABI? Value-based, sorry. The acronym. I draw a blank. I don't even draw a blank. So I'm safe ground. My dear friend and professional colleague and former boss, Dr. Zetti, also went blank on acronyms. Never use an acronym with Dr. Zetti because she'll say, what does it stand for? If you don't know what it stands for, you're a dead man. But she's always pushed back on. So there are differences, but most of the differences are around the value, around the risk sharing, but also if you link. And this is something I've been doing since 2015 when the SDGs were published. You can link every SDG to an objective under the Makatib Sharia. Islamic finance is all about that. Yeah, that's what it is. And we haven't pushed that far enough. And we've got a lot of work to do. But my view on the future of Islamic finance here is I don't see Islamic finance taking over and ruling the world. I'd love that. But let's be realistic. What we've got to do, and the answer is not to sort of isolate and say Iran does this and Sudan used to do this. Pakistan tried twice and failed. And then you get the question, why is the majority of the Saudi economy not just Islam? I mean, they're indefensible position. What we've got to do is demonstrate how a divine-based economy, nothing's going to change here. We look back, there is no God but Allah. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last prophet. The components are all out there. We just have to reassemble them in the modern age. We're not going to get a new prophet. We're certainly not going to get a new God. But the whole set of answers is out there, and that's what we must work on. So those differences, what we have to accentuate now, I think, is the risk sharing and the focus on the SDG stuff, and demonstrate that what we have is a better and fairer system. When people start understanding, and I found this since my retirement, I did some work with the International Federation of Red Cross for drought and famine relief in East Africa. And it's a long story, but the vast majority of the funding for this project came from zakat contributions from the state of Perth. Zakat from Perth. They had solved all their problems first, and they had a few million over. They decided to put it there. And it went into a project in Kenya, in a county in Kenya, which had a population of about 1.2 million in abject poverty, no water. Their crops were failing. What we did, we applied the money to a solar-driven well pump and an alternative crop. We used the latest science from the Climate Center in the Netherlands and the Crops for the Future Center, and we grew different crops. They were growing maize, not enough water died, and we then grew green grass. And they had two crops a year as opposed to one, and we created a cash surplus. and we set up cooperatives, not Islamic banks, but cooperatives working on a Sharia basis. What was extremely, and we brought 1.2 million people out of poverty, and they made profit. What did they do with the profit? They obviously improved their healthcare, education, and whatever, but the surplus from that they gave to the next county to do the same thing. 1 million people, and it's still going on. This was 6 years ago it started. The interesting fact here is the zakat money that came from Perlis, that first county in Kenya, 80% Christian, 20% Muslim. The county next door, which the first county, Kitui County, gave the money to after they made the surplus, was 80% Muslim, 20% Christian. That to me is the, and it's still giving money, it's still generating revenue from that first 5 million injection from zakat money in Perlis, the gift that keeps on giving. Completely changed the lives now, close to 10 million people who may have been dead had they not got the water. I've got other stories, but that will probably remain in mind. That's the difference. Why am I a Muslim? Yeah, and it's like everybody born. I can share with you some of the most powerful things up until the time I heard that I'd ever heard about me was at a conference of Sharia scholars. And I won't say the location because Mufti will probably figure out who it was and what it was. That's not the point. But it was a number of years ago. It was probably 20. I was at a conference. It was the Sharia Scholars Conference. I'd been invited to speak, and there was a panel, small panel. It was, I think it was 3 or 4. On the panel was a leading Islamic finance proponent who I consider a mentor, Dr. Yahya Abdul, based in the US. Some of you may have heard of him. He's written some very, very interesting books. And the Sharia scholars, bless them, were being quite antagonistic. Not in a rude way, but it's like, what's this white guy doing here? Approach. What is credibility? Dr. Yahya, who had known me some time, and known I've been active and done stuff, said, brothers, all right, now he deserves to be here. He's run this, he's done this and done that. But most important, and he looked at the 100 or so scholars, all male, there were no female scholars, great. That's changed. He said, brothers, we're all brothers in Islam here. All of us in this room, with the exception of Daud, and he always called me David, which I'm fine with because that's the name my mother gave. He said, all of us in this room are Muslim, or were born Muslim. And he said to me, all except David, brothers, never forget this man had a choice. At that point, 20 years ago, that was the most powerful thing I've heard said about me. I've never thought it, partly in answer to your question over there, is that I had a choice to do. Those of you who were born Muslim had no choice. Now, I don't say that in any negative thing, but you never had a chance, to think of anything else. You are and you did. I had a choice. I want to do this stuff. And from the day I said, this is what I was going to do, this is what I want to do. With a passion. Maybe I get it wrong, maybe I do stuff, but it's the message I put across. So, why are we here? Why can we differentiate? I think the young generation here, there's a great opportunity to think about the broader issue. Rather than, it's more about the substance of what we're doing than the form. Not that I disagree with them. The form is a representation, it's a discipline of what we do. The substance of what we are, the values that we have, the expressions of particularly around things like greed. And a lot of what motivates, interest and whatever the capitalism is based around greed. And not to say that there aren't greedy Muslims. But is something that we can address, that there is abundance for everybody. If we play it by the rules which have been established in the Quran and the Hadith, that we have an opportunity to think about it, and we have to demonstrate the positivity of the effect, the channel. And let me finish on just one other. Whilst I was in India, I was invited to speak at an international conference in Des Moines, Iowa, Middle America. It was called the Global Insurance Forum. And the guy who was running it, or who was chairman of the Global Insurance Forum, was also chairman of the Principal Group, which IIiBF used to partner with, probably still does partner. And Larry asked me to come and speak and do a lunchtime address keynote on Buffett to this international audience. And I said, how international is it? And he said, well, they'll be from the US and Canada, and there'll be from the UK or from Malaysia. I thought, okay, this could be a bit of a challenge. I went away and thought about it, and I did a very, what I would call light-hearted presentation, which demonstrated the very close similarities between Tuckerpool and mutual insurance. And you can sort of go down a list of stuff, and everything's the same until you get to the, is it Sharia compliant or is it not? When of course there's an opportunity for difference. And you can see I call them the Americans in the audience, they were like, so we've got a business here, and we could send this to the Gulf and to all these other rich places. You could see them thinking about it. Well, if we do mutual insurance, we're 9/10 of the way there to doing Tuckerpool. And I said, yeah, you have. Not that there was the political correctness. You see them mumbling as they were chewing into their hamburgers and fries, whatever they were having for lunch. And then a guy asked me a question, and this is the final point I make. He asked me a question. He said, yeah, but we couldn't accept Sharia law here. And I said, where? And he said, well, no, he's asking you to accept Sharia law because you already are. And he looked back at me and went, what? And I said, what kind of lawyer are you? And he said, I'm a trust lawyer. And I said, well, so what's the basis of US trust law? And he went, English common law of trust. Okay. I said, can you cite me an example, an early example in history of a trust that was set up in England? And he looked back at me and said, I can't think of one at the moment, but I'm sure you've got one. I said, yes, I do have. And I said, you go back to the 13th century, I get the year wrong, I think it's 1264. If you look at the trust deed that established the first college in Oxford University, Merton College, it's an exact copy of an Islamic waqf. That is the basis of trust law in the US. I was a little bit annoyed. I said, QED, you have Sharia law. And everybody went, oh. And the reason I spoke to Dr. Zetti. He said, you're my stealth weapon. I said, I'm 6'6" tall. I'm not that stealthy. No, but you don't look like one. Inferring I don't look like a Muslim. There, I could get away with stuff. I could, they couldn't stop me because I'd already started and I'd already observed this stuff. And I think that, I'm proud to be what I am. I am, and I try to do what I do. But you also have to seek out the opportunities that when you get an opportunity to correct in a gentle way, that history doesn't say that, this is this, that, people start realizing the contribution that has been made. Good set of questions. And you need to finish, or you want me to repeat one?
We just have one question.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I can give to the madam, but just one question.
By the way, I also get many questions.
Oh,
Sorry,
that's
to me.
the second series of question.
But just a comment. I also get a lot of questions like how you me as well.
Yeah.
So I pretend to be not to be one. I'm see what they're about to by kind of say, don't worry. That's when I'm going to do.
Yeah, I've played that similar games as well. It's quite interesting.
Salam Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So really the great experiences, your exposure, your perception you've gone through, from what is it here in the past, present, and see these are really a good reference for going forward. So looking at the topic here, talent development in Islamic finance. So past, present, and future. What you have shared with us here is really a great reference to be followed by this new talent, irrespective if it's within the institution or you're still studying university or any institution. Now going forward, this is the one I think is like the things that I've been thinking around, I've been working in a bank and also I've been teaching at universities. So the first is there, the present, it's ongoing, going forward. It is present and going forward. Now the Islamic banking, an example is simulations. It's really there to be perfect there. But what is the talent management here that looking at shows that all of them, and a good example is that when the thing research on banking and finance, you start going into the industry. Some are working in the sector that are not really the actual industry platform. Now, when we enter the industry platform, the most they could go in the bank is a Sharia commitment, Sharia review, Sharia audit. Okay, so the risk portfolio in the bank would not be able to fill up like this. Student or degree holder could also go into another portfolio with a lot more in the banking of business. Actually, the most important is risk management, is banking management. You can go to treasury, you go to more. So I'm looking into that. How are we going to help this, especially those fresh from the banking institution, and also going to be into that in what is it, talent within the working industry itself. Okay, how to do that? No, it's a pity when we interview them. The issue never interview. That's one question that time. And you don't know. You know, how do you do this? Certain area, you need to leave. Definitely, for example, to be a private officer, a good advisor. So that we able to them to answer that properly. I'm trying to make that available. That's one thing. Okay? The other thing is that after received several communication, from students and how we do it. Just myself with this into the banking industry, for example, I'm working into a banking environment. So this question that alert me. How do you need to go forward? Yeah, but if I to accommodate with this and to give them a really an opportunity, in banking industry, so they could also enter service analysis, risk management, interaction. What is that? If you have value to the student, not to be really detailed, but at least they know generally what it is. There's a guide for, I think, 100 students will look at some of the that have been communicated with the so want to think of it. So that's really good. Going forward, what is that? We need to make it very clear.
From the website.
My MSc when I was still the president of Israel. I think the first one is your vast experience. How do you think training of Islamic finance and banking students from the university and other institutions have impacted on the perception of clients, Islamic banking and finance plans how has it impacted on clients of Islamic banking and finance? And then the second question, and normally when we talk about the conventional economics and finance, mostly you hear from, especially from the professionals of Sharia economics and finance, that conventional finance and economics is based on, this is what we commonly hear. And normally I wonder, is this a conscious switch
or unconsciously. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm told I've still got a few minutes, but I'm always better if I try and sort of condense these things down, because all of these are great questions, which you could probably spend a day debating. To our sister's questions over there, around, the Sharia, say, education and making it relevant. I think, well, I have two parts to the answer. The first part is that I'm not convinced any longer that the future is around Islamic banking. So I hope I'm not scaremongering, but I don't see the banking system as it's seen today being as relevant in the future. And I can talk about, what's already happening with the digital, with wallets, the digital banks which are coming out, the concept of tokenization and the tradability of that. I had discussions with a sovereign wealth fund last week and an extremely innovative fintech company that I sit on the board of, with the sovereign wealth fund here in Malaysia, and you can probably Kazana, about tokenization of pensions. And just taking the dimensions cross-border, completely borderless transactions. So my first part of the answer to your question is that I'm not sure that this is the focus anymore. Okay, but it's still going to be there. It isn't going to disappear. Second part, in terms of the second part of the answer is assuming it is going to be around for a time, that things have progressed. And more people generally have a better grounding in Sharia than used to have 20 years ago. And with, British, that's just a fact of life. I can share with you a horrendous example of me coming to a university not dissimilar from this 25 years ago in this country. And without exception, an audience of 100 Muslims, the audience did not know that a Muslim could eat pork. They didn't have any understanding of the Sharia and the fact that if your life depends on it, you are. They didn't know the answer to that question. I think things have moved on quite a bit from there. I think here, the where people pose is that in terms of what's happening today, and I think this moves on to your second question, but I'm trying to answer in part with the first. My second part. It's the realization that it is changing the mindset, that the Sharia compliance aspect, if it is going to be there, and it will be, it's showing the relevance of that Sharia compliance in terms of what Rafi was saying in an earlier discussion, how they're moving it from halal to title, but also the idea that how representative the Muqasid al-Sharia is of sustainability and the goals around planetary health overall. And that, I think, is where the alignment comes. And where people should be growing and developing. It's the active use of Sharia to promote that in terms of the risk management and the taking of credit as well. And also the other area of relevance is in the digital side, the marketing, the way in which you get messages across, the way in which you deliver the customer experience. Yeah. When I worked for an American bank, one of our main competitors in the international market, I didn't work for them, but they were the main competitor. It was Citibank. And in the 80s and 90s, Citibank were absolutely huge. One of the things Citibank did extraordinarily well as a bank was go into countries and just be able to set up and market and attract customers that they wanted and generate business. And they had a service mantra. In other words, this is all their service people. This was drummed into them at their training schools and whatever else. And it was from the point of view of the customer, and all of their service people would talk this. If I give you today what I gave you yesterday, and this is in terms of customer service, I have cheated you. So everybody in that bank was focused on, if I deliver today what I used to deliver to you yesterday in terms of customer service, I'm shortchanging you. I'm cheating you. I therefore need to be innovating and thinking about how I make the customer experience better. And so that, that is a mentality issue. And relevant to what's happening today, there may be others, but for me, I can see getting Sharia people and people who are doing Islamic banking and finance and whatever else, more focused on digitization and sustainability. So that's the way to go. You asked, the first question was about has this made a difference to the perception of the client? I would argue yes, but, and the but is could we do more or should we have done more? The answer is I think we could have done. I think there's a growing recognition that in the industry, the people who are delivering the service are better qualified, that they've got CIFP or whatever, CIIF or whatever it is. When I was a young lad growing up in banking in the UK, you could not see a customer in terms of a lending interview unless you got your Institute of Bankers exam and you could demonstrate that you were a qualified banker. You could be a teller, you could take a customer inquiry, but the moment you got into a lending interview to provide service, you could not, it was illegal, I think it still is, for you to interact with a customer unless you were a qualified practitioner. We're not there yet, but I think there's a recognition that the customer base here and in other countries is expecting a better knowledge, expecting a professional standard, and is expecting that. So there is a recognition amongst customers that I'm expecting professional expertise. Quite what that is, I'm not sure they define it. I'm not sure they say, well, there's an institute in Malaysia that does it, or there's an institute in Bahrain, but they are expecting that level of professionalism. Your second question, I've noted down here, unconscious, but perhaps you'd repeat your question. Is it an unconscious?
The question is that conventional economics, for instance, is based on
Right. Okay.
It's conscious or unconscious.
Okay. Yeah, you're going to get me to philosophize. If you read a book by Lord Adair Turner, called Between Debt and the Devil, and Lord Turner I managed to bring on as an adjunct professor at IIiBF, and he was the chairman of the Financial Services Authority in the UK. He's a renowned economist and humanitarian. And to be in the same room as him with Dr. Zeti and with Dr. Miracle, having a discussion about this probably 10 years ago, was an absolute privilege. If you read that book, Between Debt and the Devil, he is expressing that the problem around greed is through the creation of debt, and interest on interest is the problem and the challenge. And he in some ways validates, without saying it in so many words, that the Islamic system is probably better. But there is the challenge about you don't suddenly flip from Keynesian economics to Islamic economics. Although Keynesian economics does have some value on this, but the answer to your question, I think if I'm generous, I'd say it is unconscious with most people, because that's what's become expected. The idea of interest on interest, and the whole thing accumulates. But if you avoid debt, then you're in a much better place. But the expectation in society now is based on personal self-aggrandizement. Oh, that's a big word. But it's about, I want to have a new car, I want to have a new washing machine, I want my children to have this. It's not needs-based in terms of basic elements of survival and so on. And it's very challenging, when you're in a society where you've got consumerism in your face the whole time. Sometimes you do need a dose of reality. I can share with you briefly, in 1991, I was made redundant from the job I had. And I was well paid, but the company folded and I was out of a job. And at that age, I was 40 or just coming up to 40 and trying to get a job in the city of London at that age was impossible. I sent out 300 job applications. I got one interview and I failed. I failed to get a job. What did I do? Necessity is the mother of invention. I set up my own business, and the second piece of work I got was to come to Malaysia and to work at UMBC, and the rest is history. But it was the realization at that time that, you know, the house that I had a mortgage on and the standard of living I had was all completely at risk. I did get in the UK a certain amount of unemployment benefit, but it was certainly not enough to cover my mortgage and living. So I was forced to set up my own company, which was a good thing. And I went to night school to learn how to do it, and I set up my company. So the message I've got here is that until you actually sort of face that reality, you know, you are unconscious about it. I was just living my life happily and generally following what everybody else did. And then something happened and I had to change and I had to pack my bags, travel somewhere else, and I made money. And you know, I eventually came to Malaysia. I actually went to Indonesia first. I went to Hong Kong and then Indonesia, Macau, and that's another story about close to Hong Kong. The reason I went there is it's still a Portuguese colony. And in my past, I worked in Brazil and I speak Brazilian Portuguese. So I went to Macau and spoke Brazilian Portuguese to Portuguese speaking, but it worked. And then I came to Malaysia and my life changed. And I think it's a personal kind of revelation that you're unconscious about it until you suddenly have it. I mean, I don't know your background, but I know you're Bosnia and the horrible thing probably happening in your life. And I'd love to hear the rest of your story on another day. Maybe set that up. But everybody has met these challenges, and as a result, it's a life-changing thing. But until you're there, most people can generally wander along and don't rock the boat too much. I hope that answers your question. It's a very personal answer. Probably I'm over.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's all the time that we have. Definitely we can, you know, find out the procedure. Like, okay. But just before we conclude this, to share about the information about this series. We're going to have the next point in June. We're going to have a physical, so I would like to get your favors to spread the news. Probably if you have a suggestion for what the topic will be the next one, that'll be good. Then we can. The thing is that we are so used to the online discussion now. So now we are trying to bring back the atmosphere. Like Mr. Daud mentioned that we need the human touch. I don't think AI can replace that. We
didn't get on to AI. I have even on that.
I mean, now I think I got back to the MP for the next session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nazrul Hazizi, for conducting this wonderful session. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guest, Mr. Daud Vicary, for sharing his insightful reflection on talent development in Islamic finance. We have learned a great deal from Mr. Vicary's vast experience and expertise in the field, and his talk has given us much more ponder as we look towards the future of Islamic finance. The quote by Maulana Rumi that comes in my mind right now. Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself. So this quote encapsulates the essence of what Mr. Daud Vicary has shared with us today. That talent development is not just about changing the world, but about changing ourselves as individual and organization. But by constantly improving our skills, knowledge, and attitude, we can help shape the future of Islamic finance in positive and meaningful way. Now it's time to give the token of appreciation to our honorable speaker. I would like to invite Dr. Nazrul Hazizi for hand over that token of appreciation to
We
Dr.
invite our which Professor Salinazo can join.
I would like to invite Dr.
Yeah.
Selina Kasim and Prof.
Yeah.
Adnan come on stage and
on behalf of the thank you, everyone. Thank you, those of you online. Yeah. So you guys enjoy inshallah. So I hope that so far you guys can spread the news. We're going to have the next session. So much stuff. Yeah, that's perfect. In fact, I'm nice. So I'll put that in. Yeah. Oh. We have so can you guys join? We have a photograph. Where do you stand? We stand. Just everyone be here. Yeah, everyone be here. Yeah. Come. Sir, you can come. Yeah.
all of you please come on stage. We'll have us photograph right now.
Good question. Thank you so much. Right, please, everyone. Come on. Oh. Everyone. Let's try to get everyone is oh. Yeah. No point standing behind. This side. Yeah, brothers can come this side. Yeah.
Don't know what I usually call usually.
Yeah.
In Malaysia.
Brother, come. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's have a look. Yeah, see you, brother. They just, yeah, yes. Okay, great. All right, great.
Guys.
Thank you very much. Wait a minute. That's great. You know where we hang out Thursday. Next time you buy me coffee, yeah?